Okay, guys, my name is Gene Mangum. I've been railroading for quite a while. I'm a model railroader, and this little presentation is called the Gulf Northwestern Railroad, and clearly it's fictitious, but it's a railroad that should have been. So with that, let's get cracking. And by the way, if you have a question, just tap folding on the arm or something, or do whatever you need, and I'll try to answer them as we go. Otherwise, we'll have a little session at the end if people have questions and discussions. All right, give you a little background here. All of my railroads that I built over the years did have Kerrville, my hometown, in it. One railroad that always impressed me, a fellow named Eric Bruman did one called the Utah Belt. And it always impressed me because it was a railroad that didn't exist but made sense. And so I always thought that was pretty cool. And that's what I was trying to do here. Now, in reality, the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railroad did build the Kerrville branch and finished it in 1887. They did plan to extend it probably at least to San Angelo, but they never did it. They fell into receivership in the 1890s and essentially were acquired by the SP, even though SP did lose control of them, but they did get it back in like 1915, thereabouts. And unfortunately, the Kerrville branch was abandoned essentially by 1970. Okie dokie. Now, here's the way things should have happened. The Kerrville branch clearly actually was built by the San Antonio Aransas Pass, the SAP. They did go into receivership in 1890s, but instead of the Southern Pacific grabbing them up, some wise businessmen from San Antonio, including Charles Schreiner from Kerrville and my great grandfather from Nixon, decided, look, we need access to the panhandle for all of South Texas as a true advantage to it. So they bought the SNE and AP, and they did sell some of the holdings to Southern Pacific. We okay still? All right, good. And they figured it was essential that they did build the Panhandle line because they thought it was essential to all the local people along the route and further into South Texas as well. All right, so what they did is when they got control of it, they immediately said, look, we're going to make a survey and we're going to see how far we can go. So the first part they thought, which was probably one of the most difficult terrain, was from Kerrville to Junction, Texas. And the survey went along the north bank, if you will, the Guadalupe. And then it went along the Johnson Fork of the Guadalupe to Mountain Home. Did have to cross over a pretty good divide between the Guadalupe and Llano rivers. And then it caught believe it or not, it's still called the Johnson Fork, but it was the Llano River through Segovia. And they followed it all the way to where it ran into the Llano River. And at that point, rather than trying to go down the south bank, they decided there was some pretty tough terrain. So they crossed over and went down the north bank of the river. Now, in any case, it did require some pretty darn steep grades, especially in the divide between the two rivers, and sharp curves. So the survey was done, and they liked what they heard, so they started construction in 1895. And since it's pretty tough, and it's the first one they'd done, it took maybe a year and a half for them to finish it up. And the plan and the way they did it is they put it in a small yard in Junction with both a pasture and a freight station, and did have a team track by the freight station. And as they were doing this, a lot of people said, hey, we want some local sidings in our area. So they did build a few, and they continue to do that over time. Now at Ingram and Mountain Home and Segovia, those are little bitty towns. They just built some combo stations and possibly a team track and local past customer sidings now and again. But they did have to have strategic passing sidings, especially in the area of the divide between the two rivers. Okay, they did the construction and finished it in 1897. And believe it or not, it was hugely successful because people were really dying to get produce and get supplies from San Antonio. And this is prior to anything but maybe a dirt road, maybe, that went the way. So they were able to get raw materials. They were able to then ship stuff, and not only from Kerrville, but from Junction and all the little towns, for like produce, pecans, livestock, etc. And they also got livestock back from San Antonio. At the same time, they did extend passenger service to Junction, and they had one like express that it stopped just in, say, Kerrville, Bernie, and San Antonio, and then locals that ran all the way along. So it was a success. So since it was, right away, they determined, okay, the next step is let's get to San Angelo. And believe it or not, the terrain was not as tough once you got out of the Llano River Basin through Menard and Eden, and then turned kind of west towards San Angelo, or northwest. They did have to cross two rivers and the divides, but believe it or not, the most difficult section for the entire thing was to get out of the Llano River Valley. And that area, what really caused the steep grade, 2 to 3%, and sharp curves. And that was strictly getting out there. Then it was kind of rolling terrain. And then once it got to Eden, it turned kind of left, and it was pretty well farmland to San Angelo. So the survey was 1898, okay? They started construction 1899, and since it was 100 miles thereabouts, it took them till 1902 to finish. In Angelo, they did build a nice large yard. They had engine service facilities and plenty of local passenger customer sidings there. And they did put a large passenger freight station in San Angelo. And now in Menard and Eden, they'd put maybe a small combo station, team track, and now and again, local customer sidings. Now there's two little villages called Van Court and Wall, and they were just wide spots in, quote, the road. So they just put a flag stop station there. Clearly they needed strategic passing sidings, especially across the divides and getting out of the Llano River. All right, this one, as you could imagine, was really more successful in phase one. And the reason possibly is that now they were able to export, if you will, from San Angelo via San Antonio all the way to Corpus Christi, more stuff, cotton, grains, as well as what they had been shipping. And they were then getting more information and more things that they were able to ship to San Angelo. So it really became very successful. They clearly did increase passenger service. They had some local service out of Angelo now, and they did 4 daily bidirectional chains. So they really were coming, helping the South Texas out and helping all of the communities as well along the path. All right, so they said, okay, we've done this part. Now let's branch out a bit. And I think this may be the biggest advantage they did, is that's when they built from San Angelo to Big Spring. And the advantage of this is they were able to connect with the Texas and Pacific Railroad. Now that helped both. At first you'd think, well, the T&P, they're not interested in this because it's going to steal something from them. But it worked reverse. They were getting things to Big Spring from San Antonio, and so that helped them out. So they were like happy about that. I just wanted to tell you that first. Now the terrain from San Angelo to Big Spring is pretty straightforward to sort of follow the north bank of the Concho, or the North Concho. And then, but the problem they ran into is right before they went into Big Spring, they had to cross a little creek called Beals Creek, or Bells, however you want to say it. And that did require some pretty steep grade, sharp curves, and a big long trestle across the flat part, if you will, in the creek bottom. So that was one of the issues. So the survey was in 02. It started it in mid 1903, and it took about 3 years to do. So they completed this section in 1906, and that made it fairly long railroads, like 200 to San Angelo, and then another 100. So it's 300 miles thereabouts now of that line, of the Northwest line. Well, now in Big Spring, like I said, they did negotiate with T&P to have a joint passenger station, and they built some interchange facilities with Texas and Pacific. Clearly, they did their own freight, and they had a big freight yard as well. And they did have local customer sidings, and not only there, but in Sterling City, which is a pretty well developed town, and even in those days. So they put a passenger and a freight station in Sterling City. But now these two villages, Carlsbad, Grape Creek, they were just, like I say, just wide spots. And they just put flag stop stations there. And they put strategic passing signs, mostly between the towns is where they would do those. So now, as I was explaining, it was about 300 miles of main line from San Antonio to Big Spring. And clearly they were able to double the freight service, especially with the TNP connection, both ways. Like I said, Texas Pacific was happy with this as well. Passenger service, they started local service from Big Spring going down toward Sterling City, and they kept the service from San Angelo. So they were getting more and more passenger trains, because if you think about it, in those days, 1906, there were no roads. The only way you could get around was with reasonably was with a railroad. So this really made them a very popular and profitable railroad. All right, they said, all right, while we're at it, we got to finish our goal. Now, originally, their plans were to skip this and build their own right-of-way all the way kind of west of Lubbock, west of Amarillo, and then connect up into Colorado. But they said, you know, that's probably not economically feasible. So they decided the best shot they had was just go to Lubbock and connect with the Santa Fe. So that's what they did. They planned the survey in 1906, and this is pretty straightforward terrain. It's only 110 miles, but it's pretty straightforward, easy going farmland. We went through a little town of Ackerley to La Mesa, O'Donnell, and Tahoka. The only town of any significance in here is probably La Mesa. No steep grades or sharp curves, so it didn't take us long to build. Started in 07, finished it in 1910, so it was late 07, early 10. Clearly, they had more difficulty with the Santa Fe than they did with the TNP. But they finally convinced the Santa Fe that, look, we're helping you out. I mean, yes, we're stealing some of your stuff to go to San Antonio rather than you go all the way around the Horn to San Antonio. But we're giving you a lot of good stuff going north along our railroad and then continuing on your railroads into Colorado and into Kansas and places like that. So they convinced them, and they actually did build a joint joint passenger station and interchange facilities. Now down in La Mesa, Tahoka, they built combo stations because they really weren't that big of towns. They probably got bigger later on since they had rail service. And the little flag stop at Ackerley and O'Donnell was all they did. They didn't nearly need as many strategic passing signs, but they did put some in just so you could pass without being in a town. All right. As I mentioned earlier, this doubled their bidirectional freight service. And Santa Fe was happy because they were getting stuff from the south toward the north, even though we were stealing stuff from them from north to south. Passenger services doubled as well. And so you had 10 bidirectional trains. And so now the line was really working for not only freight service, but for passenger service. So that they were really happy campers. I drew a map here. All these maps and stuff I drew by hand, if you will, using some kind of software and Windows. But as you can kind of see, the line that goes from San Antonio to Lubbock was what they call the Northwest line, and then we did continue to Corpus. And Corpus Christi was really beginning to burgeon as well, especially with the direct connection to do this. Oh, wait a minute, I got it, okay. All right, so they'd met their original goal. It was extremely profitable. And this was probably, I'm showing this map is like in 1915. And they were a good bridge line in the area. But one of the things that's interesting is that about this time, prior to World War I, they were already considering maybe there were some oil deposits out in West Texas in what they call the Permian Basin. So that's an interesting thing to consider. Uh-oh, what happened here? Here we go. All right. So anyway, after World War I and during World War I, if you'll remember, all the rail lines in this country were nationalized. So that after World War I, they came back to their being the G&W. And it was a good bridge line all the way from the Panhandle to the Gulf. They improved the economies just like they hoped they would. And then oil discovery really thought, okay, this could this could work to our advantage. They were poised for deliveries clearly around the Midland, Odessa area, that they could bring it up on the TNP and then down toward Corpus Christi. And meanwhile, the Corpus Christi people were happy, but they said, hey, you know what? We'll build a refinery there in Corpus so that we can take the crude and refine it there. Then one other thing happened, and that was oil discovered further south, down around area Fort Stockton, Bakersfield, and area Ariane. And so in 1920, they said, hey, look, what we want to do, let's build us a western line from Junction toward Fort Stockton. And so the board agreed that that was what they wanted to continue to do. So the first phase of was a survey, and it was going to go from Junction and to basically to Ozona, Texas. And it followed the North Llano, kind of on the north bank, and then in a little village of Roosevelt, it crossed the river, and then it went along the south bank, if you will, and then out through some rolling hills, went into Sonora, across the Dry Devils River there, several other pretty creeks on the way to Ozona. Now, in the way there, they did run into some steep grades and some fairly sharp curves to get around that issue. So that was some of the issues they were running into. Now, the second phase of the survey was, let's go from Fort Stockton back to Ozona, or Ozona to Fort Stockton. And while they were surveying that route, they said, while we're at it, let's go ahead and consider one up to a little town called Imperial, which they had a pretty good oil strike there, and to Ariane, where there was another big strike of oil. Now, from Ozona to the Pecos River was the roughest terrain, especially around the Pecos River. They had awful issues there, and they ended up, I'll display it in a minute, but they made Sheffield into like a helper place. But from Sheffield to Fort Stockton, it was very easy terrain, just sort of went up like a valley and then got up on the flats. So the survey started in 1920, about 100 miles of that second part. Now, to save time, what they did is they said, we're going to start like eastward from Fort Stockton and westward from Junction with two crews. And then that way they could have a little competition so you could get there first. And it turns out the quote golden spike was occurred around Sheffield, Texas. And while they were at it, they went ahead and did the branches that went up to Imperial and up to Ariane. Okay. Do I say admit here? I guess I do. Okay, you're good. Okay. Now, what they did, they started the construction. I don't know, maybe I skipped. It doesn't make a difference. They went ahead and put some substantial passenger freight stations in Stockton, and then the Kansas City, Mexico, and Orient Railroad had sneaked in there. That it actually came kind of southwest, and so they ended up having interchange with that railroad. Now it never really, it's still there as a matter of fact, under some other name, but it really never prospered as much as it could have. And Sonora and Ozona, they put just combo stations, local team tracks, etc. And the little villages of Roosevelt, Sheffield, and Bakersfield just put flag stop stations. They did put oil loading sidings in Bakersfield. And at Ariane, they put a combo station and some oil sidings deals. Imperial, only oil loading sidings. No real passenger facilities, because if oil workers needed to go from Fort Stockton, they would just hook a little, like a drover's caboose on it and just take them up that way rather than having official passenger facilities. Now in Sheffield, I mentioned before, they had to have an engine facility with turntables for helpers to get out of the Pecos River Valley. And clearly there were many needs for strategic passing sidings in this path. All right, like I said, survey, then while they were at it, they said, you know what, we really could go all the way to the TNP and again, and steal some stuff from the Southern Pacific. And the Texas Pacific was just tickled to participate in that, because they said, yeah, we can, go into Kent and we'll steal the stuff there, and then you guys take it on to San Antonio. Now, on the survey path, it was very simple, relatively easy terrain from Fort Stockton to a town called Balmorhea. And like the interstate now, it crossed just north of Balmorhea because south of there was some pretty rugged terrain. Now, once you get past Balmorhea, the Davis Mountains, they're the foothills, if you will. There were some pretty nasty areas there, so you had some steep grades and sharp curves. And then you went southwest toward Kent. So that survey was in 22. Now they started in 24 and finished it in 1926. So at that point, then you had two lines, one that connected the Texas and Pacific and went to San Antonio, the one in Kent and the one in Big Spring. And Kent, the Texas Pacific, was just thrilled to have this done. So they were willing, or more than willing, to participate with them and put a big engine facility there and interchange facilities. In Balmorhea, all they did was put a combo station, team tracks, etc. They didn't realize then how important Balmorhea would be when all of the irrigation stuff came in. So eventually they added more stuff there because it became a pretty good produce market in its own right. They clearly needed strategic pass areas, but they needed those mostly west of Balmorhea. What did it do? Well, it doubled the bidirectional freight service with the new T&P connection. Irritated the Southern Pacific Railroad, I'm sure. They had ended up with 10 daily bidirectional trains along the line, 2 express trains and some through trains from San Antonio to Kent. So they did take some stuff from the SP. It became extremely profitable. And because clearly the crude oil shipments, which could compete very well with pipelines, it took a while to build them. You had to have all these pumping stations. So early on, crude oil shipping by train worked well. So essentially, the crude oil shipments alone made the line a profitable deal. And then with the bridge traffic they stole from the Southern Pacific, it became one of the most profitable railroads in Texas. So that's the good news. You had 2 lines. You had if you will, the Northwest line and the Western line. Now, okay, with the success of the San Angelo extension, the board responded to a request. They said Fredericksburg was a little bit miffed because they were irritated at the SAP all along because they were hoping or thinking that clearly that branch would, instead of going to Kerrville, go to Fredericksburg. All right, so the SAP board, the GNW board said, okay, we'll help you out here. We'll agree to provide a branch line to Fredericksburg. And even though I'm talking about it now, this happened early on, right after San Angelo stuff was completed. So they were thinking, maybe do we bring this out of Kerrville, or do we go back to Comfort? Because they already had the survey sort of from Comfort, even though that would require that tunnel that you may have seen the approaches to, and it's theoretically still there because I think they really did build one eventually. It would require some steep grades even with the tunnel and some sharp curves. So the survey was in 1906. They started it in 06. It took a couple of more years to finish because of the issues they had with the tunnel. Now, it really turned out, though, because Fredericksburg, they put in a small yard combo station and a team track. And then as time passes, they put in more local customer sidings and strategic passing sidings, okay? And it became an economic success, in my opinion, mostly because the Pedernales Valley is really a fertile ground. And they then were able to export that and put through to San Antonio. Now, I don't mention this here, but later on, I'll explain when it went in another world, they connected Fredericksburg to Llano with the Southern Pacific. And so that gave them access, if you will, think about it, kind of to the north. So when this was done, it was just one daily freight from Kerrville and one daily passenger train. Now, the Hunt branch, when I was a kid, I worked as a camp counselor at one of the camps along the river. And I tell you what, those camps have been there for a long time. And about 1920, when the railroads were pretty successful, and it was the way to go to get to Kerrville because like you say, the roads were pretty rotten. A lot of the camp owners really requested that they build them a railroad connection to their camps. And the board agreed because a lot of, as you see here, read here, the campers came from influential people in San Antonio, Dallas, and Houston. And that is absolutely true. When I was up there, I mean, some of these kids were really wealthy. So they agreed they would do this. So they did a little survey. They went from Ingram west to Hunt, crossed the river, stayed on the north bank for a bit. And then when they get to Hunt, they crossed over because that's where the South Fork and the North Fork of the river go. So Hunt is basically between the two. They put a Y in, and then they extended along the South Fork, North bank of the South Fork and the South bank of the North Fork to cover all the camps. So that they did the quick survey on it. They did start in 21 and finish 23, and because they had to build a bridge across the Guadalupe, the North Fork of the Guadalupe at Hunt. They just put a little combo station and Hunt and a Y and a team track. Along the camp entrances, all they built were flag stops. And now during the camp season, they would have a passenger train that would run up, take the Y and back. At the year round, they had a mixed freight that actually just went to Hunt. It didn't go all the way up and down the stuff. Now, the Bandera branch, when they first wanted it, they were about the time of, we'd say, well, hell, if Fredericksburg could get one, we ought to get one. Well, it was going to cost a lot of money to put a big bridge across the Guadalupe. And they said, no, we'll just forget that. However, with the success of the Western Line, the board finally agreed to provide branch service to Bandera. They figured the best place to cross the river was in a little town of Legion, which is just a suburb almost of Kerrville. And the way they would go is kind of south toward, and then they cross the Guadalupe Medina watersheds about halfway down, and they get to Bandera. And it would require steep grades, especially in that area. The rest of it was pretty rolling, easy terrain, and sharp curves. While they were at it, they determined to go ahead and extend the route to Medina, which is about another 15 miles. So that they went ahead and did the survey on that. They started construction 27 and completed it in 1929, kind of an ominous year for railroads and people. And Bandera, they did a small yard, a little combo station, a medium size, the typical team tracks, customer sidings. Medina, they'd put a small combination yard and team track. And they needed passing sidings, especially in the area of the divide between the Guadalupe and the Medina River. So I would say, even with the major bridge cost, there was economic success. Now, it wasn't essentially all right away because of the Depression, but it became a very, very cool branch, and they made money on it, but it probably wasn't immediately recovered because this whole area is good for fruits and nowadays wineries. But they did have a daily freight from Kerrville and a daily passenger train from Kerrville, just one at a time. All right. I'm going to talk now about what I call the independent years, the summary of that. In essentially 1930, okay, the Northwest Line, which is 425 miles, finished in 10. It like I say here, you can just sort of read it. The original intent of the railroad came to pass. Then they discovered when they were moving a lot of tonnage, down to basically to the ports. And then when oil was discovered in the Western Line to Fort Stockton, Kent completed, and stealing a lot of the services from the Southern Pacific and possibly some from the Santa Fe on the Western Line, then they became a very powerful railroad. I mean, the G&W. Like I say, crude oil shipments and bridge line shipments, profitable. Corpus Christi, deepwater port, refining center, that helped a bunch. So actually, I'd say the success of the Gulf Northwestern kind of began to fret the Southern Pacific and the Santa Fe more than anyone else. So now we're going to talk about what I call affiliations and mergers. So clearly the railroad's completely independent until in the 1930s. And so it was pursued, as you say here, and it pursued some railroads because they were as powerful and solvent as anybody going. So what I'm going to talk about next are, and now I've got this information from the internet, and it's as good as I can get it. If there's errors, please tell me about it. So first we're going to talk about are the railroads that it was dealing with. Now the Southern Pacific Railroad first. They began in the late 1870s when they were coming from the east toward the west, and SP was coming from west toward the east. And they had a deal with the Gould family, who owned a bunch of railroads or shares in a bunch of railroads, that they would meet the Texas and Pacific in El Paso. And then, okay, Southern Pacific showed up 1881, the Texas and Pacific did not. So the Southern Pacific decided to continue to Sierra Blanca, Texas, which is real. Now that really happened in 1883. And then what they did, and the Gould family was a little irritated. They said, well, wait for it. I said, no chance, we're not going to wait. And this is real. This is really true. This isn't a legend. So they built it to Sierra Blanca, but then they allowed trackage rights for the Texas and Pacific from Sierra Blanca to El Paso. Then, once they got to Sierra Blanca, they continued southeastward. They met the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad near Sanderson, Texas, in 1885. They did acquire the TNNO, Texas New Orleans Railroad, in 1881. The path, if you will, from New Orleans to the West Coast was called the Sunset Route, and it was always operated under the TNNO name. Now, one other issue here, the SSW, the Cotton Belt line, it was replaced under receivership, if you will. I'm sorry, under control of the SPP system by the ICC. And even though the SSW was operating semi-independently, it was under the control of the Southern Pacific. So in the time frame of like 1930s, the SP was a powerful railroad as the Great Depression persisted, I say here. All right, the next we'll talk about is the Missouri Pacific. Now, it was originally chartered in the 1850s as what they called the Pacific Railroad. And now they struggled and were reorganized and named the Missouri Pacific Railway in the 1870s. Oh, there was Gould family. They controlled them from 1870s till about 1915, when then they went into bankruptcy. They just bankrupted them. About right before World War I, they were merged with SLIMS, the St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern. And that's when they became the Missouri Pacific Mopac Railroad. That was in 1917. Now, they were pretty rambunctious because over the next decade or so, they gained control over one that's very important, and was very important, if you will, to the ideas of the Gulf Northwestern. And that was the line that went from New Orleans via Baton Rouge and all the way to Houston to Brownsville. They got that one in 1925. They got the INGN in 1925 as well, which gave them a path from Hearne all the way to Laredo via San Antonio and Austin. And in 28, they got the T&P because that was also Gould family holding. So in 30, they were pretty powerful. But the rub is they weren't as financially correct, if you will, as this SPE or the GNW. The Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, from what I was reading on the internet, it was the first railroad that actually entered Texas from the north. And that was in early 1870, 1872. Gould family, they had big interests in the MK&T as well. 1890s, they actually got as far as Waco and nearly to Houston. And as I say here, by 1915, they had 1,100 miles of track. They went from Oklahoma to San Antonio and to Houston in the southeast. There is an MK&T line from Austin that goes from Austin to Houston, and from San Marcos to Houston. They kind of meet in a little town, which name I can't recall right now. But that was one of the other holdings that they had. In 23, after they had been in receivership, that's when they became the Missouri, Kansas, Texas, the MKT. They were not as successful as some, but they were mostly successful, okay? Both the railroads were kind of interested in one another, but not as much as you would think. All right, the other railroad that had some influence with the Gulf Northwestern and Santa Fe. There were two subsidiaries in Texas that were Santa Fe, if you will, the Panhandle in Santa Fe and the Gulf Colorado in Santa Fe. Now, the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe was started in the early 1870s and actually comes through Rosenberg, the area that I volunteered at a railroad museum there, so they come through here. But the rub is it was kind of financially weak. And so the Santa Fe acquired all of their assets in 1887. And in the early 30s, believe it or not, the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe was the main Santa Fe operating entity, and it was for a good while. So if you look, the Santa Fe was not controlled, but it was run by the Gulf Colorado Santa Fe. We only touched once the Gulf Northwestern Santa Fe in Lubbock, but that's not quite right. There's another little branch that went down toward Menard. But in the time frame of the 1930s, that was not a Santa Fe. It was some other little railroad. But eventually they got control of it. All right, here's where we get interesting. Gulf Northwestern was way more powerful as far as money than the MOPAC. So the MOPAC was struggling, and they were really going to go into bankruptcy. So what the G&W board did is we wanted some of their routes. We wanted a TNP line from El Paso to Fort Worth, and we wanted the line from Laredo through San Antonio to Fort Worth, and that line from Houston to the Rio Grande Valley. We wanted to buy those from and help the MOPAC out. Well, the MOPAC says, wait a minute, now we want more money than that. And by the way, we don't want to be decimated. We want you to buy all of the railroad, our holdings in Texas. So they agreed, and they, with a little larger fee, they actually became the owner of all MOPAC holdings in Texas. And believe it or not, that was probably one of the key factors in the Gulf Northwestern future, especially the TNP line that runs from El Paso across this line that goes from Houston, if you will, or actually goes from like Beaumont all the way down to Brownsville, and the one that ran north all the way from Laredo to Dallas and such. So that was a very important point. Okay. Now, the Southern Pacific, meanwhile, they were a little miffed about this. So they wanted to buy not all of the Gulf Northwestern, but just two lines. They wanted that Western line and the Northwestern line. Which said, no, we're not interested. They're not, but they weren't interested in the line that went to Corpus, which I don't get, but they really weren't. All right, well, we said, no, not going to happen to you. But what we will do is offer you trackage rights on the Northwestern line that goes from San Antonio to Lubbock. And all we want out of it is trackage rights on the SP line from San Antonio to Houston. Okay. SP countered. They said, we want the Western instead of the Northwestern, and the line from San Antonio to Austin, which was originally a MOPAC line. So we negotiated back and forth. I say we, the G&W, negotiated with them. And we said, all right, the agreement finally be that they would have trackage rights on the Northwestern line to Lubbock, where they could kind of compete a little bit with the Santa Fe as well. And we would have trackage rights on the one from Houston to San Antonio. And then SP would also have trackage rights from San Antonio to Austin. That was part of the agreement. And it did really work well for the remainder of the Depression years. Now, during World War II, all the railroads did well. I mean, clearly, the freight business, passenger bases boomed. Navy built a big naval air station in Corpus Christi. And this really happened. I mean, this isn't part of the legend. But that really helped the Gulf Northwestern's position. Now, one of the things that I found that was useful to them is with all these the hill country area, the Gulf Northwestern was one of the very first to get away from steam. They just dieselized everything. One crew, multi-unit diesels. And so in my world, the late 1940s, the Gulf Northwestern was fully dieselized. Now, Unfortunately, the poor MK&T after World War II, they struggled more than most railroads. They had issues with weather. They were more of a Granger railroad, a lot of debt, equipment problems, etc. So the Gulf Northwestern sent a proposal to MK&T, just much like with the MOPAC, and said, "Hey, but while we're at it, we'll just buy all the holdings you have in Texas and help you guys out." So they did negotiate with them, and the MK&T agreed. And so Gulf Northwestern became the owner of all MK&T properties in Texas in 1953. In 53, several redundant lines were consolidated. Remember that from basically San Antonio all the way to Waco, the MK&T and the MOPAC kind of ran not side by side, but almost side by side. And so what the Gulf Northwestern did is they said, we're not going to abandon any rail served customers. So we're going to take the best line, but if you have a customer that's on this other line, we'll make sure that they still have service. And that really struck a good point with the customers, the rail served customers. Now, when this happened, when the MK&T acquisition, then actually at that point, the Gulf Northwestern was the biggest railroad in Texas, not the biggest railroad period, but the biggest one in Texas, bigger than Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, in all of them. So they all got kind of nervous. Now, remember the Gulf Northwestern already had an affiliation with the SP. So they received a proposal from the SP to merge basically to buy the G&W holdings and consolidate it with the Southern Pacific in Texas. Our board said, no, we'll think about that, but here's some other things we want. Instead of you just buying us out, we want a whole board membership. We want to be on the board so that we can help with good decisions, because sometimes we don't think you guys make good decisions. And also we want to be able to operate much like the Cotton Belt or SSW, where we're semi-independently. The board agreed and the merger was ratified. And so in 1954, the Gulf Northwestern Railroad became Southern Pacific, essentially. So the SP now was the largest railroad in the state of Texas, even larger than Santa Fe by a long shot. Now, during the late 50s, the I call them new blood representatives really helped the SP. What they did is with airplanes becoming more and more prevalent, they talked them out of running long distance trains, maybe other than one or two now and then, and let's concentrate on more regional service. And that way the airlines can't compete yet in that regard, but they can compete efficiently on the long distance one. And another thing we want you to do is to quit dragging your feet in your major freight hubs so you can get stuff going. And that was to counter long distance truck traffic, because in the late 50s, that's when the interstate system was beginning to come into at least thought. And these people say, wait a minute, eventually with the interstate, then we're going to have some issues. And so they made the freight hubs, if you will, more efficient. And that really resonated. It worked. The contained regional passenger service worked well. The airlines could not counter it. Eventually, clearly they can, but they couldn't in those days. And the freight service made a really big difference, especially on the major places like the California area, the Houston to St. Louis, those areas. The more efficient freight service really resonated, made a big difference. All right, as the merger continued, during 1959, the Southern Pacific, if you will, adopted their bloody nose paint, and the Gulf Northwestern, like the Cotton Belt, did the same. And instead, much like the Cotton Belt, the side of the gray locomotive said Gulf Northwestern, but a little different than the Cotton Belt. The nose, the G&W was painted on the nose. And these locomotives, if you will, ran throughout the system, much like the Cotton Belt does. So during the 60s and 70s, the SP system really became a profitable enterprise. A lot of it due to the fact that the Gulf Northwestern people were a little smarter than some of the California people. So now let's talk about the SP-SF merger, which did happen, but in this world, it happened a lot better than it did the otherwise. So as they approached, it became apparent that more consolidations and mergers were going to happen. In 1980, this has kind of really helped. This is real. This really helped. The Cotton Belt acquired from the Rock Island the Golden State route, which kind of went from El Paso, kind of up through Mexico, across the Panhandle of Texas to Kansas City. And what that really did, it gave the SP system a kind of a direct shot to Kansas City, not quite direct, but more direct than they ever had before. Meanwhile, the UP acquired the Western Pacific. And when they did that, the Southern Pacific said, wait a minute, we would like the Denver Rio Grande so we could have north-south as well as going kind of northeast. Clearly, UP was not for that. So the SP called on the Santa Fe to say, help them out. Santa Fe was tickled too. So they actually got on a merger with the Rio Grande. So now that became part of the SP. Meanwhile, the SP and SF said, hey, you know, what if we joined forces, because the UP is pretty stout up in the West. So they did it. They did what you've heard about is the Southern Pacific Santa Fe Railroad in 1983. However, due to the influence and the smart tennis played by the Gulf Northwestern part of the board, in my alternate history, the ICC did not shoot down this merger, so it actually worked. So, believe it or not, at the time, SPF became one of the largest railroads in the western part of the U.S. And the reason I say is what I just told you, that the G&W board members really made a difference in the way the thing worked. No rail serve customers were abandoned, even with route consolidation, and that the SPSF customers were really happy, and they increased their freight revenues through the 80s and early 90s. All right. In early 1996, the XPFF and the BN decided they would join forces against the UP in the Chicago Northwestern, which had just merged in 1995. So they agreed and generated a new, what I call mega railroad, and it was accepted by the ICC in the fall of 1997. And this new railroad is named the Great Western Railroad of America, GWR, and is clearly the largest railroad in the country. Now, here I'm saying this, without the G&W, SP would not have been strong enough to accomplish the SPSF merger and subsequent mega merger with the BN. So in my world, the wise businessmen, including my great grandfather and Charles Schreiner, were the real heroes and what made the Gulf Northwestern a success.